Right, hello everybody. So today is Saturday, May the 11th. Um, it's really interesting. We had a solar storm or a geo-electromagnetic storm last night. The where I live in British Columbia, the northern lights or the solar flare was highly visible, and this is kind of interesting to see how this is timing up with the sun in a conjunction with Jupiter and Uranus, creating this Jupiter Cazimi, which is like the death and rebirth of Jupiter before Jupiter's ingress into Gemini, which is one part of the equation that I didn't really go into in my last video about the Jupiter ingress in Gemini that I made the other day. And at the same time, last night there's like a kind of a bar pub nearby where I live that has been closed during the pandemic, and it just recently opened for this year. Like last summer, it was completely closed, but this summer it's open, and there was lots of loud noises and stuff like that from people watching the hockey game at this bar. So there's kind of like an interesting atmosphere going on with both the solar flare, northern lights activity with the activity of people who are into sports, the Stanley Cup playoffs in my area, and there's something that I'm wanting to get into here with what happens when Mars in Aries is approaching a conjunction with the North Node, right? And I've noticed watching other astrologers that I follow are focusing more often on the effect of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction with Venus and Taurus. And of course, in Taurus, you've got both the benefics of Jupiter and Venus being in domicile dignity. However, in that sense, people are portraying that as being a bit more positive. And however, there's something about doing these astrology videos that I'm trying to be careful with, because I don't know if there's like some kind of effect of, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, that kind of thing, or the idea that like you don't want to there's this tendency towards I've noticed a lot of New Agers, when they that kind of approach to astrology is to focus more on what they consider to be positive, because if you start the more you invest energy into the bad things that are going on, you start to see more of that or something like that, right? And I don't know if that is just like an illusion because you're looking at it more, you see it more, or if by paying attention to it, it actually makes more things happen, or if or maybe that is kind of monomania by saying that the whole world just depends on what it is that I'm paying attention to, right? That could be a kind of a monomania solipsism, right? But I do consider, the way that I do astrology, I consider both the North Node and the South Node to be malefics. I don't see the North Node, I don't have a very positive look at the North Node at all. But Mars is in domicile dignity in Aries, but I won't get into the specific details, but since Mars has been in Aries, there's been a lot of stuff in the news about crime and violence and things like that. And I also saw in the news recently that, I'm Canadian, and in the Canadian news, they released a report on the increase of rage across Canada. Now, what I find interesting about this is that they did make a distinction that the East Coast, or in Ontario specifically, there was more people who were filling out this poll, the survey, were reporting greater instances of rage and anger and frustration than people where I live on the West Coast. Although I thought this was kind of funny because then the newscaster went on. They're trying to speculate as to why West Coasters were less prone to rage, especially when apparently like if you look at the price of gas, I think that they probably have less expensive gas prices in Ontario. But the thing is, they're across Canada, there's a housing crisis, a lack of affordable housing, and people generally being frustrated with the price of food and the price of the cost of living. They were also speculating that, maybe West Coasters are more happy. As I said, with the Stanley Cup playoffs are happening, and the Vancouver Canucks and the Edmonton Oilers are apparently, I don't watch hockey anymore. But apparently the Canucks and the Oilers are playing, and whereas the Toronto Maple Leafs aren't in the playoffs, they lost or whatever. But they were kind of speculating. I thought it was interesting the language the guys on the CBC broadcast used, because in I'm looking around and I've been noticing all sorts of stuff I won't go into detail about because there's all sorts of violence and crime and bad shit going on that I don't want to put a magnifying glass up to. But they were saying that there was the tendency of West Coasters to be a little bit more laid back, a little bit more less prone to rage, that there's a certain kind of a stigma attached to that. But they kind of, I don't know if they were just kind of talking too fast and not really getting into it. But, I would think that if somebody had anger issues, if you were somebody who is had a bad reputation of being an angry abuser or a person who got it took the rage out on people or was I would think there would be a stigma associated with that. And if you were just a laid back guy who didn't get angry and was really chilled out and peaceful, I don't really understand how that associates to there being a stigma, right? Because especially in the eyes of rage and anger causing a kind of a problem, you think that would be more of a thing that would be stigmatized and discriminated against. But I think the kind of the implication here is that if you are a good hardworking honest guy, that there's a certain kind of rage that goes with that, right? There's a certain dignified self-righteous anger, and that if you have the nerve even to be calm and peaceful, then you must be some kind of asshole, basically, right? And I think what I'm trying to say is that there may be a kind of if you're not angry, if you're not enraged, it may be a good time to sort of try to. I'm not making a prescription here for anybody, but I think there may be a certain wisdom in social withdrawal and social avoidance. And basically, maybe isolating yourself and avoiding people who may be prone to raging out, right? And this is one thing that, living in Vancouver, before, I have to just say that there's this thing about, why I'm not so into, watching hockey. I mean, I think maybe in some respect, where you get into this thing that feels very much to me like the Roman, the gladiators or the Colosseum, or you get the masses all kind of you have a whole frustrated population, but they have some sort of collective outlet to funnel their rage and frustration into in the form of a mass sports spectacle. And I read Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan was actually very much in favor of this. He was very much in favor of a kind of, but he was thought that there was a kind of potential of public sports to tie into what the ancient Greeks were doing, where it wasn't just, it was a kind of a symbolic play where the sports teams were representing this sort of mythical drama playing out, that they were enacting the drama of the cosmos through this big sports spectacle, and that it wasn't just sport, it was a kind of artistic thing, maybe even, right? And that McLuhan was in favor of this sort of level of mass involvement in sports, but I don't know if this is because of my own I'll give you a bit of an anecdote here. Like, and this might be just sort of superstition, right? But like I admittedly am somebody who suffered from psychosis back in 2011 and 2012 was when I was having problems with mental health and I was hospitalized and stuff like that, right? And one of the things that preceded, like, there's all these things where I'm not gonna like just single out one thing as like the cause or like the one, because like, I did make in another video I was talking about Instagram that happened around this time, and that not making Instagram into one singular cause, but one factor in the whole cultural climate of what was going on. There's other things at that time, like the Fukushima, the Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street, all happening around the time when I was having this sort of mental health thing going on. But one of the things that happened, local to the area that I live, was that they had the Stanley Cup playoffs in Vancouver, and I went out with some friends and found myself in the big riot. You know, I didn't do much rioting myself, but I was there in this, and it was kind of messed up because you kind of saw that the masses of people who you're used to being orderly and civilized and stuff, using a certain cultural moment, a certain the peak experience of the Vancouver Canuck getting their asses kicked by the Boston Bruins in the final round of the playoffs and losing the Stanley Cup, to like have, you can see all the ordered, civilized people who go to work and put on their uniforms and get along, and to just devolve into basically like a pack of animals who have like just want to destroy things for no reason. And like the fact that kind of destructive power is just like under, like, that we need sports to give people an outlet so that they, instead of doing anything, you know, that they can just have the spectacle to be involved in, right? I mean, probably don't have to, I mean, you probably heard this stuff before, you don't need me to tell you about it, right? But there was something that happened that, I don't know, there's maybe, I don't know if I should get into this or not, but I'm going to take a risk, I'm going to get into it. Okay, there's one of the things that happened was that my dad died of a sudden heart attack in 2013. This was actually, there's some sort of relevance here too, because if you follow the Jupiter cycle, this was when Jupiter was in Gemini. So we're having the Jupiter return of when my father died. And one of the things about this is that, like, after having my psychosis in 2011, 2012, I found that there was a certain kind of like change that I was going through in terms of the things that I was kind of identified with my city life of like going out to like, you know, shows and being into like music and in arts and stuff. Like, I sort of felt like there was not really much of a support around that. And I felt like I was kind of going through a phase where I was like drinking a lot of like just like Budweiser cheap beer, and I was wearing, like, I don't know about you guys, but do you ever feel like there's a pressure to wear certain kinds of clothes, and that you want to wear clothes that basically don't stand out, that you just kind of blend into the crowd, and that maybe like a tendency to wear a lot of blue, or like, rather than wearing black, like, you know, you're wearing a lot of like navy blue, and you're not wearing like skinny hipster jeans, but you're wearing kind of like baggier clothes, or maybe some kind of like flannel that looks like you could maybe be like, or like just in a way so that if you were in like a mob of people, that you could just basically camouflage in and have nobody recognize you as somebody that was specifically different from the herd of what was going on. And then in that kind of mindset, you can kind of sense that, like, okay, so I'm kind of like tuning into like the status quo of like where most people are at, and that being like a kind of a weird artist kid who likes to go, like, that's kind of not where people are at. But people like to like drink kind of cheap beer and watch sports, and that I'm kind of lonely and frustrated and alone. But if I do that thing that everybody else, maybe that puts me at the same wavelength as everybody else, and that in the midst, and like I basically was kind of depressed and wasn't really, I was feeling the existential grit weight of being like, who am I? What's the point of my life and all, and just like using stuff like watching sports as an escape, and at least it gives me a sense of plugging into this sort of collective. But sports can be like, especially hockey, can be really violent, right? Like people and like hockey is one of these few sports where people actually get into fist fights with each other. They actually sometimes there's a penalty to use your stick as a weapon, but there's something about that side of hockey that gets really violent that could be a problem with this Mars and Aries and the North Node. And that there was this thing. What I'm trying to get at was that it could just be superstition, but I had the day that my dad died of a heart attack. He was off playing in his jazz band. I think it's cool for him that he got to like play music up to the very point where he died. Like he was just rocking out to the last day on playing jazz music, right? But then I didn't actually see him play that performance, and the moment he died, I was at home watching a hockey game by myself, right? And there was something about that moment for me that it may not be rational. I'm not saying that it was like because I was depressed and in this weird headspace where I had kind of lost my identity as being a creative person, and I was just kind of giving into like drinking cheap beer and watching hockey and stuff like that. But there was some sort of it had this effect on me that was like the confrontation with mortality, that like you don't really know how much time you have here, right, on Earth. And that, I don't know, like, there's something about just giving yourself over to what the masses are doing and just getting into this sort of, like, to me it feels like a kind of animal brutality that comes out with some of these sports things. And I don't, my dad was into boxing and stuff, and I've never really been into, like, boxing or, like, mixed martial arts for that reason. But it's kind of this thing of, like, that since that time happened, that where my dad had a heart attack while I was watching a hockey game and died, I just haven't watched hockey since then. I just completely don't watch hockey. I don't watch sports. I've never been into I've never watched Super Bowl or football. And like hockey was something a little bit more local that I could get into. Like the one sport that I would watch if I was going to watch sports would be hockey. But I've just made this resolution, like what I'm going to do with my time and energy is do something other than watch sports and not be a hockey guy, not be a jock, just to do something. And it's not, I don't know if you guys can really understand what I'm saying about, because it's not really rash. It could just be a trauma of like, I associate parental death with sports. I'm not saying that they go together or that they cause each other, but there's something in that moment which made me more aware of the fact of there's this like idea that the philosopher Heidegger had, this idea of Dasein, right? This idea that when you're aware of your own mortality, and that when you're aware that you have a limited time here on Earth, and that you have to like make choices about what you're going to invest your time into, what you're going to invest your energy into, and what you're not going to invest your time into, and what you're not going to invest your energy into. For me, somehow there was like, I wasn't even reading Heidegger at this period of time, but there was this kind of sense that like the tendency to go like is my life, right? I'm not going to surrender to just be trying to like fit into the lowest common denominator of where the herd, the pack. It sounds like, I don't know. It's also the kind of Nietzschean thing, right? Of like avoiding the herd morality, or of avoiding the kind of the pack of like bloodthirsty animals who want to see like gladiators, like, rip each other apart in the Colosseum. It's like, this kind of I mean, there's the Mars. I'm just saying the Mars Aries North Node. There could be this individuating thing that moves you away from that kind of stuff, rather than getting pulled into those collective energies. Or at least that's how I make sense of it myself, right? That your life is yours to live, and why on earth are you going to spend that just doing what everybody else does? For the sake that, like, maybe you get more security, right? Maybe being one, like, there's the question, and then I've also, like, the question of, like, having this sort of, like, the courage to, like, stand on your own and do your own thing, or are you going to get pulled into the crowd of drunken rioters the next Stanley Cup? There's going to be another Stanley Cup riot or something like this, right? Like, and that's kind of like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if this is, like, again, I don't know if this is too much to go into this stuff in my astrology channel, but this is part of, like, I used to be more into it, right? I used to watch sports, I used to watch the Stanley Cup, but now I make a hard line, like, not gonna watch it at all. Not gonna put on a Canucks jersey. I completely avoid all sports whatsoever, right? And I'm not saying that you have to make that specific choice, but that, like, it's your life to do what you want with it. And I think there's something about the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction and this Jupiter-Uranus Cazimi that's happening that maybe goes with that, right? That there's some kind of, like, Jupiter is kind of like seeing how everything has its own place in this kind of, like, cosmic scheme of things. But that if you accept that your life is your life, and you have a limited time and a limited degree of what you can do, I think there's something about, like, it's not wrong to sort of eliminate certain options that are just going to be for other people and focus on what you are here to do. Because, yeah, I mean, you can save that stuff for another lifetime, right? I don't know. This is just, and yeah, I mean, there's also this whole thing about, I mean, I guess I could say also with the violence and stuff, I don't know. There's a part of me that does want to find, like, community, or, like, get involved, not just be isolated, but to be, like, part of something going on. But, like, there's always this, like, I'm also just thinking there's a good time, as somebody who lives in BC, if you, like, this whole thing, like, I don't really go out very much anymore, not since the pandemic, and I've been thinking about it. But there's this whole thing that has this, like, bad reputation in Vancouver, downtown Vancouver, the entertainment district, where if you go, like, this whole thing of, like, you gotta find some, like, if you just go where the masses are all heading, there's a sort of tendency of, like, this frustration that comes out of people who just get into, like, drunken fights outside of nightclubs and stuff like that, or there's this kind of, like, this weird, like I'm saying, like, there's this sort of, like, for some reason, the stigma, like in the CBC thing, the stigma there's not, people who are angry and violent aren't stigmatized. It's the people who are calm and peaceful and laid back that are stigmatized. And then so the what is acceptable, like what's acceptable is for people to be really hardworking, to work your ass off, and then have everybody funnels into one entertainment district to get drunk. And then you just kick the shit out of each other to blow off steam, right? You just beat each other up, and that is, like, what's a socially acceptable outlet of your frustration. And it's like a sign that you're a hard worker, and it's a good thing to be angry, and it's a good thing to be, and there's this kind of underlying, dare I say, fascism of, like, having all this self-righteous anger of, like, the good old boys, right? The good old boys, who just want to fuck shit up after watching the hockey game, right? And I'm just saying, like, I don't think I think it's maybe a good idea to just like try to figure out where those, try to separate yourself from those, don't go out, or like if you're going out to go drinking and partying, just be aware, because I think with this Mars North Node stuff, it could get pretty bad, right? And for the like, when I was younger, I was more likely to go and like hang out at a watch the Stanley Cup finals and watch people like get all go crazy and rioting. But now I'm realizing that I'm going in a different direction. That's not for me. But it sets me off at like a I don't know, like I may feel a little bit alienated because where most like the idea of like, I don't know, men's groups or where dudes are at, to me it seems like there's also like I don't really I run into this problem with, let's say, identity politics, because I'm like a straight white guy, but I feel like more there's a certain thing where I can kind of like relate more to like queer people, or I'd rather be at a party with a bunch of queer people than be like trying to watch like, well, I know maybe it's a false dichotomy, because there's a lot of these people that could be like, I kind of associate the whole thing about being into sports and being like a bodybuilder or being to like Joe Rogan or something like that as being a very kind of like straight hetero thing. But if you go to like gay parties, what's funny? Like, if you guys have, like, I don't know how many of, like, I've talked about nightlife on here before, and I think there's a lot of people in my audience who really don't go out and party or don't go out and get into the nightlife thing. But there's this thing about, like, if you go to, like, gay techno parties, there are a lot of really, like, muscly, athletic gay dudes who like go to these parties to take their shirt off and like flex their muscles around, and it's sort of like this kind of thing about like this like kind of the health optimization like culture around like sports and all this kind of, but like that there's something about like athletic culture which could be really homoerotic, right? Like, especially, like, this comes out a lot of the time with like football, and people say that there's this kind of like like a lot of times sports is not only like an outlet for this sort of aggression that's under the surface, but it's also an outlet for this sort of homoeroticism, right? Because you see like football players will often like slap each other on the butt, or like they get all like kind of weird and like, I mean, I don't want to come off as being homophobic, but I mean saying there's certain like there are these certain undercurrents which could either be like homoeroticism or violence that are given a sort of like outlet in kind of this like mass sports culture, that could be like a factor with the current astrological dynamics of there's an excess of yang energy basically with the Mars and the North Node, and it's also kind of happening at the same time as the Jupiter Cazimi, happening at the same time as we're getting all these like weird solar flares that I have to admit, like, I don't want to play it up too much in this direction, but it did, like, if you read H.P. Lovecraft, there's something about like going outside, and it wasn't just like a little bit of northern lights. The whole sky was like had these weird streaks and colors, and it was like it felt a little like something out of a Lovecraft story with all this kind of stuff going on, right? So I don't know. This is this is just what's on my mind right now. I'll leave it at that. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel. Catch you next time. Okay.